I thought I was driving toward peace, that soft kind of peace you convince yourself you've earned after a divorce, after the paperwork and the silence and the nights where you stare at a ceiling and wonder if your life is just going to be a series of smaller rooms forever. And then I turned onto the last stretch of gravel leading to my newly purchased land outside Cedar Hollow, and my dream home, my 2-acre blank canvas, my new chapter, got body slammed by something so absurd my brain refused to label it real at first, because blocking my only access point, perfectly positioned like a barricade in a movie, sat an entire rusty freight train, not a cute little museum engine, not a decorative caboose, an actual line of cargo cars and a locomotive, lined up with surgical intent across the one road my deed said I could use. I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, blinking, because in my head I heard my own voice saying, "No way." And then I heard another voice, my father's voice, the one he used to drop like a warning shot whenever I signed anything larger than a restaurant receipt. Richard Carter, retired real estate attorney, the man who never trusted a handshake when a signature existed, always checked the fine print, son, because that's where they hide the daggers. And suddenly I could feel those daggers. Not metaphorically, but like someone had pressed them into my ribs with a smile. My name is Noah Carter. I'm 35. I'm an architect. I design spaces for a living because I like the idea that a good plan can tame chaos. And after my divorce, I poured every last saved dollar into this property. Partly because it was beautiful, partly because it was affordable, and mostly because it was just outside the reach of the Cedar Hollow Community Association, the kind of neighborhood group that loves rules the way some people love oxygen. Except there was one catch, one thread I knew could be pulled if someone wanted to hurt me: an easement, a legally recorded right-of-way through their land to reach mine, explicitly included in my purchase contract, signed, notarized, registered, the kind of thing you don't interpret, you respect. So when the person on the phone at the association office told me their association president, Miranda Glass, would meet me on site, I almost laughed, because in my head I already pictured the smile, the tone, the way people like that speak like they're doing you a favor by not stepping on your throat today. 20 minutes later, a glossy white SUV rolled up like it owned the air, and out stepped Miranda Glass, late 30s, designer clothes that somehow still looked like a costume. Bleach blonde hair pulled so tight it made her face look sharper, oversized sunglasses hiding her eyes like a shield, and she walked right up to me with a smile that was technically a smile in the same way a closed sign is technically a message. "Mr. Carter," she said, sweet as fake honey. "Welcome to Cedar Hollow. I see you've discovered our exciting new Railway Heritage Preservation Initiative." And then she motioned to the train like it was a gift, like it was a community treasure, like it wasn't a steel middle finger blocking my entire future. I held up my easement documents. I kept my voice even, because anger is a currency people like her spend for sport. This road is my legal access. It cannot be obstructed. That's not opinion. That's recorded property law. And she didn't even flinch. She just tilted her head, like I was a child insisting the sky belonged to me. "That agreement predates our updated bylaws," she said, waving the words around like a magic wand. "The board passed emergency regulations. Cultural preservation takes precedence over individual access rights." And then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if we were sharing a secret. "But we might be able to work something out if you're interested in joining the association. We could create an alternate access point for a reasonable fee." That's when the absurdity snapped into clarity, because this train didn't look like an abandoned relic. It looked arranged, curated, placed, and the timing was too perfect. Just days before I was scheduled to start surveys, just days before I'd bring contractors and stakes and plans. And it hit me that this wasn't heritage, it was leverage, a manufactured crisis to force me into their little kingdom or push me off my own land until I gave up. I drove home with that train image burned into my brain. And instead of sleeping, I did what architects do when reality turns hostile. I researched, and the more I pulled threads, the more it stank. The local historical society told me there was no significant railway heritage there. Tracks were removed decades ago. No designation, no paperwork, nothing. And a local contractor told me something even more damning. That train wasn't there last week. They hauled it in on flatbeds, 3 of them. Assembled it like IKEA for psychopaths. And I just sat with that sentence in my chest, feeling the rage simmer under the surface, because someone had spent money to block me, which meant someone expected profit in return. and they had no idea how badly I hate being cornered. The next morning, I walked into the Cedar Hollow Community Association office, a converted ranch house dressed up with fresh paint like lipstick on a liar, walls covered in framed posters about heritage that looked suspiciously new, like they'd been printed yesterday to support today's scam, and behind the front desk sat Hannah Park, the association secretary, who couldn't hold my gaze when I mentioned the train, her fingers fidgeting with papers like her hands knew this was wrong even if her mouth couldn't say it. She led me into a conference room where Miranda Glass sat beside their attorney, Grant Holloway, a balding man in an expensive suit that didn't fit right, which somehow made him look even more like a hired weapon, and they both performed the same routine, concern, community, culture, identity. The board unanimously approved it, and when I slid my easement documents across the table, Grant Holloway tapped a highlighted section of bylaws, as if highlighter ink could override the county recorder. Emergency Preservation Measures, he said, Section 7.3, Community Initiatives take precedence, and I asked the question they didn't want, the question that turns a costume into a confession. Who verified the historical claims? Where are the state approvals, the documentation, the filings? And Miranda Glass smiled a fraction slower. We have an independent committee, she said. It's all handled. And I noticed Hannah Park flinch at the phrase, independent committee, like someone had just said a name she wasn't allowed to hear. On my way out, in the parking lot, a white-haired man stopped me, checked over his shoulder like we were in a spy movie filmed in a suburb, and said, "Meet me at Juniper Bean Cafe at 2. I'm Ray Dalton, and I know what's really happening." Then he walked away before I could even respond, which is the kind of move you only make when you're terrified and sure at the same time. At 2 o'clock sharp, Ray Dalton slid a folder across the table, old maps, decommissioned records, city ownership transfers, and he said, with the bluntness of someone who spent a lifetime around machinery that doesn't care about feelings, "What they're telling you is garbage. The tracks were removed in 1975. The city owned that corridor long before this association even existed. They have zero claim." And then he leaned in, voice dropping. "But here's the real game. Miranda Glass is building a fake heritage park to secure a huge grant from the Heritage Renewal Trust, and she needs adjacent properties to inflate the project, including yours. She's promised kickbacks through ghost consulting companies, and she's not new at this. She got fired from a museum back in the day for embezzlement, but her husband's connections buried it." I felt my stomach twist, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed the shape of what I was up against, not a petty rule enforcer, but an organized scheme wrapped in wholesome language. And the worst part was how clean it looked from the outside, because scams like this don't smell like crime until you open the drawer and see the receipts. I went hunting for proof like my life depended on it, because in a way it did. And at the library, with the help of Marilyn Knox, the librarian who treated history like it mattered, I dug through digitized county maps and resolutions. And there it was, clear as daylight. The rail corridor had been transferred to municipal ownership, the association formed years later. No permits issued for any rail installation for decades. And then an older transportation employee, Edwin Price, confirmed it. With a tired chuckle over his lunch, "Nobody can reinstall rail anything without state permits. There are none, not even close." So I went to see the train up close, not from the blocked road, but hiking in from a back trail like some kind of suburban guerrilla, and up close the deception practically screamed. Paint layered to fake rust, modern bolts, modern materials, and on one car a partially hidden plaque that made me laugh in disbelief because it was so stupid it was almost beautiful. A label identifying it as a movie prop used in a film shot 3 years prior. That was when the harassment started tightening. Certified letters accusing me of trespassing on a protected site. New signs around my land reading Heritage Conservation Area. Guards taking photos when I approached, and emails from Miranda Glass offering collaboration. With threats buried like needles, it would be a shame if access issues prevented you from enjoying your investment. Then, in a moment that still makes my skin prickle, Hannah Park found me at an outdoor restaurant far from the neighborhood, sat down like she was stepping on a thin ice, and whispered, "I shouldn't be talking to you, but she's not just unfair, she's illegal." And she slid a USB drive across the table like it weighed 100 pounds. "These are internal documents. Your property is marked as an acquisition target." She's including it in the grant proposal, and the board doesn't see the real Finances, she keeps them on a separate system. I stared at that tiny piece of plastic, realizing the story had shifted from "get my access back" to "this whole thing is rotten." And that night, exhausted, furious, and close to giving up, I called my father, Richard Carter, and he said the sentence that changed the war. Every association lives and dies by its founding documents, covenants, bylaws, articles of incorporation. If she's lying about history, she's lying about something else too. Follow the paper trail, find the crack in the armor. So the next morning I went to the county registrar, pulled every original document and every amendment, sat in a coffee shop with a stack of paperwork like a man building a weapon out of ink, and I found it. A requirement that amendments needed a supermajority vote and multiple board signatures, which the emergency preservation rules conveniently bypassed. And then I noticed something even uglier. Signatures that looked too similar, and a handwriting expert confirmed what my gut already knew. At least 2 of these signatures were forged, which meant this wasn't just shady, it was criminal. And once a bully crosses into forgery, the game stops being social. It becomes legal, and legal is where I'm very comfortable. We built a quiet coalition, residents who'd been fined into silence, people who'd watched Miranda Glass turn a neighborhood into a controlled zone. And we met in parks like strangers, trading documents and testimonies like contraband. And with Ray Dalton's history records, Hannah Park's internal files, and my own research, our attorney drafted complaints to the court and the state, plus a report to the Heritage Renewal Trust, who responded with immediate disgust and cooperation because nobody likes being played, especially wealthy foundations with reputations to protect. Then came the twist, the kind of twist that makes you sit back and realize the universe has a sense of humor. Because while digging through the original founding paperwork, I found a forgotten provision, buried like a landmine in old language, an article stating that in cases of abuse for personal gain, the association could be dissolved by a single vote cast by a holder of an original certified copy of the founding bylaws, a relic clause meant as a failsafe, a last resort, a self-destruct button. And the reason it still existed, untouched, overlooked, was because nobody ever expected someone to actually read that far. I set a trap with truth, because Miranda Glass emailed me an offer, suddenly polite, suddenly reasonable, offering me a paid role as preservation architect, promising to restore access if I signed an NDA, trying to buy my silence with money and flattery. And I replied, calmly, "Let's meet at the notary Friday at 10. And she walked into that meeting thinking she was about to close a deal. Friday, bright sunlight, sterile office lighting, and Miranda Glass arrived with Grant Holloway, and a representative connected to the grant process, smiling like winners. And I sat there steady, letting them talk, letting them assume. And then the door opened, and in walked Hannah Park and Ray Dalton, and behind them a woman in a tailored suit who introduced herself as Agent Lila Moreno from the county prosecutor's office. And the air changed instantly, because confidence can survive anger, but it cannot survive authority. I placed my documents on the table, not her agreement, but our complaint packet, evidence of forged signatures, evidence of fraudulent grant proposals, proof the rail corridor wasn't theirs, proof the train was a prop, proof they'd bypassed required votes, proof they'd misused funds. And Agent Lila Moreno began reading the allegations out loud with the kind of calm that sounds like a judge's gavel before it falls. Grant Holloway started distancing himself in real time, mumbling about acting on instructions, and Miranda Glass's face drained of color as the room stopped being her stage and became a courtroom preview. And then I pulled out the founding bylaws, pointed to the dissolution provision, and I felt something settle inside me. Not revenge, not rage, but clarity. The kind you get when you finally stop negotiating with someone who never intended to be fair. "I am the legal holder of an original certified copy," I said, voice even. "And under Article 12, I hereby cast the vote to dissolve the Cedar Hollow Community Association effective immediately." And for a second, everything was quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when an engine shuts off and the world realizes it's been running on stolen fuel. Miranda Glass tried threats, then pleas, then threats again, talking about connections, about consequences, about how this wasn't over. And I looked at her and felt no hate, just a strange pity for someone who built an identity out of control. Because when control breaks, they don't know who they are without it. And Agent Lila Moreno escorted her out for further questioning while she shot me a look like poison. and all I could think was, you brought a train to a signature fight, and you still lost. Within days the news spread. Some residents celebrated like they'd been paroled, others panicked about standards. But the train came down, city workers dismantling it piece by piece, and watching those cars roll away felt like watching a lie physically disassemble. And we held a community meeting in a park, not to replace one tyrant with another, but to build something voluntary, transparent, human, a neighborhood that could cooperate without being ruled. The Heritage Renewal Trust, now represented by Derek Langford, offered to fund a legitimate greenway project on the former corridor, a walking trail, benches, trees, something real instead of fake history, and I ended up designing a home on my land that felt like a bridge instead of a bunker. Because somewhere in the middle of all this I realized my fresh start wasn't just about escaping my past. It was about learning to defend my future without becoming the kind of person I was fighting. Closure came quietly, not with fireworks, but with access restored, with the road open, with the sun hitting my property like it was finally allowed to exist again. And later we learned Miranda Glass faced charges tied to fraud, forgery, and financial misconduct, the kind of consequences that don't care how confident your smile is. And now I want to leave you with the question I still chew on when I drive down that road and see the place where the train once sat like a threat. If someone builds an empire on intimidation and paperwork tricks, and the only way to stop them is to use the same paperwork, the same fine print, the same legal leverage they thought nobody would ever read, where does justice end and revenge begin? And if you were in my shoes, would you have taken the money and signed the NDA to protect yourself? Or would you have detonated the whole system and risked the fallout to free everyone else too?